Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be talking about your favourite books of 2023. I have been dying to do this video. I was planning to do one for the year of 2022 as well, but this type of video does actually take quite a lot of prep. So this year I thought I'm going to do it. I have to do it because a lot of booktubers and reviewers right now, including myself, are doing their best of list for 2023, and sometimes you want to get a different opinion, and I wanted to get all of your folks' opinions on what your favourite books were in 2023. So I posted across all my social media channels, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and I got a lot of responses. My tweet actually went semi-viral. You know, I got thousands of people viewing the tweet and I got hundreds and hundreds of comments both on my Instagram and my Twitter, people telling me what their favourite book was in 2023, specifically what their favourite science fiction and fantasy book was in 2023. So we're going to jump in. I will do a very quick summary of each of the books, unless it is a series, in which case I will give you a sense of the vibe of the series. There are only a few instances where that happens. The other thing that I will say before I jump in is thanks to everybody who participated. It took me a while to collate everything across all the different channels, but honestly, I actually had quite a lot of fun doing it and I'm really excited to share the results with you all. So without further ado, let's jump in. Oh, and last comment before I actually do jump in is this video is titled as your top 20 books of 2023 as it relates to the sci-fi and fantasy genre, but in actual fact it's actually the top 18. Because of YouTube algorithms, I have to say top 20. They like round numbers for some reason, but I decided to go with the top 18 because the drop off between what was in 18th place and what was in 20th place was huge, and I thought it just made much more sense to keep it to very high numbers. Every single one of these books got above 30 votes. And with that in mind, let's jump in. So in 18th place, we have The Lost War, which is book 1 in the Aiden saga. No idea if that's how you pronounce it, by Justin Lee Anderson. This book is following the state of Aiden after a war has happened. It is about a ragtag group of individuals trying to restore a queen to her throne. Sounds like a really fun time. It's not one that I've read, but I have actually had on my radar for quite some time. I have owned the first book for a while. I just haven't had a chance to get to it yet. I do believe the trilogy is complete now, and I've heard really good things about Justin Lee Anderson's writing style. With rich world building, compelling characters, and a really solid writing style, I'm unsurprised that this book is on this list. In next place, we actually have an author, and with that author, there are 2 separate books that I'm going to mention. So we have Guy Gavriel Kay, my main man. I adore Guy Gavriel Kay, big fan of his work. And we actually have 2 books that I haven't personally read. And the first one is A Song for Arbonne. This is about troubadour culture in Provence in the Middle Ages. I've heard that there is a lot of politicking, lots of different people warring against each other. Machiavelli apparently could learn a lesson or 2 from the characters in this book, and I've heard that the world building is also incredible, as is to be expected by Guy Gavriel Kay. The second book that was referenced quite a few times was Under Heaven. Under Heaven is another standalone, and this is a story of honour and power set in a world that is based on 8th century China. I think there is a strong thriller aspect to this book, and as is always to be expected by Gavriel Kay, sumptuous world building, compelling characters, and incredible writing. So also unsurprised that this one is also on this list. Next up, we have a self-published book, and this is one of quite a few self-published books on this list, which is always amazing to hear, and that is Never Die by Rob J. Hayes. This is a standalone fantasy. It is a story based on Japanese lore, from what I understand. There's samurai, there's spirits, it's about angered gods. It's a very epic fantasy with a very, very cool and unique magic system that I'm definitely going to read, because this one seems to get raved about quite a lot and I'm very excited to pick it up myself personally. Next up, we have another self-published book, and that is The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wang. This is a book about war. This is a book about motherhood. This is a book about fulfilling one's destiny. It is a truly epic fantasy with some really interesting historical connotations. There is incredible character work, especially as it relates to the female characters in this book. And there's also a very intriguing magic system. I personally have read this book. I did quite like it. I did have issues with it, but I am unsurprised that this is a book that keeps getting referenced in everybody's favourite lists. Next up, we have a sci-fi book, and this is a book that I've heard about a lot. I've seen it everywhere, and honestly, I'm unsurprised that it's on this list. And that is This Is How You Lose the Time War. This book is set against the backdrop of a dying world, and it's about two people who start interacting with each other via letters, and it's about their connection that develops amongst the backdrop of this incredibly complex and vast world. This is a book that I haven't personally read, and it's one of those books that I always thought I never would read because it just didn't really seem like my kind of thing. But after doing a bit more digging into it for this video, I definitely think I'm going to add it to my list now, and I'm very curious about how the book ends as well. Next up, we have another fantasy author, and I would say he's almost even what I would classify a grim dark fantasy author, and I have read one of his books, and two books were equally referenced of his, and so I will mention both. And we have The Black Tongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman. This is the first book in what I believe is expected to be a trilogy, and I loved it. It is very much an adventure, questing fantasy, but there is some very dark undertones to this book, and it is fantastic. The characters are lovable, the world building is fantastic, and there are moments where you will laugh out loud, there are moments where you will flinch. It's just an all-around good time. Then we have Between Two Fires, which is a standalone, and this is kind of horror, grim dark fantasy, I believe. Not a book that I've read, but I have owned for many years. I believe this is set in the 14th century in a Norman village where the Black Death has infiltrated, and there are some very strong religious connotations as well. I believe that the character work is very strong. One of the things that constantly gets referenced whenever I see this book being talked about is the atmosphere and the tone that Buehlman creates to create this very creepy yet also atmospheric read. I wasn't planning to read this book this year, but after seeing so many people rave about it whilst I was preparing for this video, definitely going to pick it up, so I can't wait. The next book is another fantasy book, and this is by an author that I have actually read, and it is a book that I am currently reading, and by the time this video is out, I will have finished it. But based on what I've read so far, I think it's completely deserving of its place, and that is The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. This book is about two warriors who shepherd an ancient god across a broken land to end the tyrannical reign of a royal family. It is incredible. I am about 30-40% of my way through, and I'm purposefully savouring my read of this book because it is very lyrical, the prose is beautiful, it's just absolutely delightful to read, and it's one of those books that I think everyone will take something from it just because of the way that Jimenez writes. It's incredible and is utmostly deserving of its place on this list, and in my opinion should even be higher up because it's that good. In 11th place, and I've just realised I haven't really been using the numbers, so let's start using the numbers. In 11th place, we have Babel by R.F. Kuang. I'm completely unsurprised that this book is on this list just because it was everywhere, and you can tell whoever the publisher was put a lot of money and marketing dollars into making this book popular because it worked and it was everywhere, and it's definitely topped a lot of lists. I've seen a lot of people talk about it. This book is about the power of language and the violence of colonialism. It's set in a dark academic setting. It's actually set in Oxford, which is where I was born and raised, and it's also where I'm currently living. So that's quite fun. Personally not read this one yet, but I do think I will get to it, but not for many, many years. But I am very intrigued, particularly by the thematic work, because it does discuss some very interesting themes that I am personally quite invested in. Completely unsurprised it's on this list though. Like, I was not at all shocked to see as many people reference it as they did. Next up, we have another self-published fantasy book, and this is the third book in a trilogy, so I will not talk about what this book is about just because I don't want to accidentally spoil books 1 and 2, and that is Of War and Ruin, which is the third book in the Bound and the Broken trilogy by Ryan Cahill. This book is everywhere, and this series is everywhere, so I'm completely unsurprised that this is also on this list. I believe that this is a true epic fantasy. It's about a hero's journey. It's about kind of warring political factions and people trying to make sense of that. I think this is kind of real epic fantasy in the truest sense of the word, and I think that's great. I have had the first book myself for many years. I bought it as soon as the first book came out, but I just never really got to it, especially because epic fantasy, like true epic fantasy, is not something that I typically read a lot of. But I am very curious, and I have heard that Cahill really does stick the landing with the third and final book, so that is always really promising to hear. Next up, in ninth place, we have a sci-fi book, and I have to say this is probably the one that I completely disagree with, but it is what it is, and I'm also unsurprised that it's on this list. And that is Lightbringer by Pierce Brown. This is book 5 in the Red Rising world, and this is one of those books that I personally don't get the hype, and I'm not going to do a summary because I don't want to spoil it by accident, but you know, we're just continuing the events after book 4 and the original trilogy. I personally don't get it. I really don't, but let's just leave it there before I accidentally insult someone. I can understand why it's on this list because it's so beloved, but I don't understand why people love it so much. Somebody please tell me down below. Next up, we have a cozy fantasy read, and I've actually put both books written by this author because both were referenced quite a few times, and that is Legends and Lattes and Bookshops and Bone Dust. This is a duology. I think it's a duology, or it could be that they're two standalones, but I think it's a duology set in this kind of very low stakes bakery, I believe, where the characters are basically trying to solve a problem, but it's not, you know, saving empires or saving kings or queens or anything like that. It's very low stakes, very cozy is the perfect word. It's just very intimate and quite character driven. And I've heard really good things. It's just not really typically what I read. And I think even for someone like me who has a black heart and loves grimdark and dark fantasy, there is probably a time and place for this, and I'm very excited for that. So this is one that if you haven't read it, if you're looking for something that will just warm you up and, you know, doesn't require you to use your brain too much, but is going to give you a good time, then definitely consider checking out this one. Next up, in 7th place, we have a sci-fi book, and I have to say I'm actually quite surprised this book is on this list and that it got referenced as many times as it did, and that is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Project Hail Mary is about our main character who is the sole survivor on a mission, and he is the only person that can essentially see that mission to fruition. It's a book about friendship, it's a book about loneliness and isolation, it's a book about the importance of relationships, and it is really quite a touching read. It wasn't my favourite book, it's definitely not even one of my favourite sci-fi books that I've ever read, but I can understand why a lot of people really connect with it, especially with some of our side characters as the story develops. I am quite surprised that it's on this list though, because I remember when it first came out in 2021, like everybody was loving it, everybody was raving it, and the fact that it still continues to be raved about and got a decent amount of votes is really quite cool and quite interesting. I never would have thought that, but there you go, I was wrong. All right, let's go to our 6th one, and this is a series because every single book was referenced at one point or another, and that is The Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. This is a series about the emergence of a new nation in the aftermath of the fall of a corrupt nation. It's all about building systems, about building governments, societies. There's a lot of politicking. I have heard that this series is very character centric as well. This is one of those series that I haven't read yet, but I know I will start it at least this year. But I'm very nervous because this series has the potential to become a favourite series for me based on what I've heard about it. And it's got all the things that I love in my books thematically, and I just cannot wait to read it. But I'm also purposefully putting it off because I'm so nervous. Like, I really hope I love it. I've heard great things about Ken Liu in general and his other books too. And I'm just, yeah, I'm psyched to read it, and I can't wait to hopefully mention this as one of my own favourite books in a future book list video. All right, we are down to the top 5. So one kind of word of note to say is the next 3, so 3, 4 and 5, they all have quite similar numbers, whereas books 1 and 2 are like far ahead of any of the books on this list. They're almost like double books 3, 4 and 5. So we'll do this batch of 3 and then I'll talk about our last 2. So in 5th place, we have another series, and I just amalgamated all the books because it got mentioned a lot. This is one of those series that I think will always be on this type of list just because it seems to be a modern fantasy classic now. And that's very exciting because I'm going to get to it this year, I hope, and I hope it also ends up on my own list. I wonder if anyone's guessed it now. But that is Malazan, The Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson. The books that were specifically mentioned were Dead House Gates, Toll the Hounds, Crippled God, Midnight Tides, and Memories of Ice. I'm not going to read the summaries of any of these books, but this series is real, epic, dark fantasy. It's about warring factions. It's about consequences upon consequences upon consequences of the decisions of our characters. I've heard that it's quite vague at times. You don't always know what is happening, but I've also heard that the payoff is incredibly worth it. I've also heard that it's very philosophical, it's quite dense in places. These are all things that I love. But yes, I'm very excited for this book series to be on this list, and I think, you know, if I do this video next year as well, I wouldn't be surprised if it's on this list next year too. So no surprises there. And then in fourth place, we have a book that I'm actually quite surprised is on this list, but then I'm also not, just given who the author is. And that is Tress of the Emerald Seas by Brandon Sanderson. This is one of Brandon Sanderson's secret project books, and I think this one is actually set in Japan. I think it might be set in Tokyo. No idea what it's about, and I actually don't want to do a synopsis because I actually don't want to know myself what it's about, but I do know that it's set in Tokyo, and I think it's dual POV. I think those are like the only things that I know about it. I wasn't originally planning to read this book, but now that I've actually heard a little bit more about it, I think it's maybe one of the few Brandon Sanderson books that I will get to in the coming years. I am curious, and I have to say it does have a really stunning cover as well. But yeah, I was surprised just because I haven't heard that many people talk about it, but then I'm also unsurprised because it is Brandon Sanderson, so it's almost guaranteed that there is a book of his on this list. Next up, in third place, we have another series, and I know it might come across as a little bit unfair, but it would also be unfair to list the book separately just because it is all part of the same world. And I would also consider this to be quite a modern classic, or at least it's becoming a modern classic. And I also wouldn't be surprised if this is on this list next year too. And that is The Fier World by Robin Hobb. Every single year I hear somebody raving about this series. Every single year I hear somebody saying one of the books or one of the trilogies is their favourite. It's just one of those series that is like a solid bet. And like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if it's on this list next year as well. The books that are specifically referenced are Golden Fool, Ship of Magic, Fool's Quest, Fool's Fate, and Assassin's Fate. I want to read this series myself this year, or at least the original trilogy myself this year. Similar to Dandelion Dynasty, I'm quite nervous because in theory it should be a world that I really love, but you never know what can go wrong. So fingers crossed, and I'm really unsurprised that this is on this list as well. All right, we're now to the top two. Now, these two were miles ahead compared to every single other book on this list. Number 2 had just under 100 votes, and book 1 had over 100 votes. So that is pretty cool and pretty interesting that they were so ahead of everybody else. So in second place, we have The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence. I have to say, I'm really happy to see Mark Lawrence so high up this list. I do think he's quite well known amongst grimdark fantasy fans. I wouldn't have said that at least prior to the release of this book, that he was like a mainstream fantasy author, just because his books are quite dark in tone and not everybody wants that, not everybody likes that. I think this book has really widened up his audience and his readership because everybody was raving about this book. This is actually a book that I did read myself and I did really enjoy. It is quite academic in a way, and I mean that in a positive way. I do think it's also one of those books that is better read multiple times as you get more and more from it as you read it multiple times. This book is about two unassuming characters, one who is trapped in a vast library and the other one who is trapped in a tiny settlement on the outskirts of this empire, and it's about their fates crossing. But this is set against the backdrop of an incredibly complex and rich world. It's beautifully written, the character work is fantastic, the tone is almost quite ancient, the world building is really quite something, and I have to say I'm very much unsurprised that this book is so high up this list, just because it really does deserve its place. And that then leads us with our first pick by you folks, and I have to say I wasn't actually super surprised that this book was number 1. I would have thought at the very minimum it would have made the top 3, and that is The Will of the Many by James Islington. This one is not a book that I personally read, but it is one that I'm definitely going to read maybe at some point this year. But it's set against the backdrop of an academy, and there is stuff happening in that academy which has implications on the broader world. This book has been raved about by so many people and it's gotten so much love, which is quite nice to see, especially because I personally wouldn't have considered James Islington to have been a mainstream author prior to the release of this book. I don't think a lot of people knew about the Lycanius trilogy. I did because I have the first 2 books, but otherwise, if I hadn't have done my research, I probably wouldn't have come across them. I do think this book of his has really put his name on a lot of many other readers that he hadn't had access to when he had just written Lycanius. So that's really interesting and also cool to see an author become more mainstream, because I do think a lot of the mainstream authors that we have in fantasy currently are not that great. So it's great to see that there is some fresh blood in it now, and I'm very excited to read this one. I do think this is going to be a trilogy. Only the first book is out, and the reasons commonly listed as to why this book is so good is that the writing is very strong, the character work is very compelling, there is a real sense of suspense, and overall it's just a good time. So without a doubt, I'm going to be getting to that this year, especially given that so many of you loved it. So there we have it. This was probably quite a long video. I have to say I did a lot of prep for this video, so I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up, because every little helps, and I would like a lot of people to watch this video, especially everyone who voted at a bare minimum. If you like this type of content, please do consider giving me a subscribe. This will be my last 2023 related book video now, and I really hope you enjoyed this and my other videos reviewing the books of 2023. Thanks for watching, folks, and thanks for all of your participation, and I will see you in my next video. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon. Bye.